Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're connecting from. To introduce myself, my name is Manjunath Agali. I'm part of Citrix study team leading the desktop ecosystem. I'm your host for today's webinar, and today we have BitDefender with us. Thank you for all for joining the today webinar, and I would like to welcome you all to the Citrix Ready Technical Webinar Series, where we showcase how Citrix and our partners have integrated to deliver valuable products and solutions to common problems faced by our customers today. Along with me, I have the main speakers, Sean Donaldson, Lead Enterprise Strategist from BitDefender, and I have Landon Frackley, Principal Networking Sales Engineer from Citrix. Moving on to introduce Citrix Ready. Citrix Ready is an end-to-end technology partner program that showcases and recommends third-party products, solutions, and services that demonstrate compatibility with Citrix products. Customers can quickly and easily find solutions recommended by Citrix in the Citrix Ready marketplace by navigating to citrixready.com/ready. For more information on the Citrix Ready program, you can navigate to citrix.com/partnerprograms/citrixready. Moving on, Citrix Ready program was launched in the year 2007. Citrix Ready program has 950 plus technology partners with over 25,000 products verifications and over 20 lakh online catalog page views. Moving on, a brief introduction about BitDefender. BitDefender is a global security technology company that delivers solutions in more than 100 countries through a network of value-added alliances, distributors, and reseller partners. Since 2001, BitDefender has consistently produced award-winning businesses and customer security technologies and is a leading security provider in virtualization and cloud technologies. BitDefender is Citrix Ready partner since 2012. Today we are here to focus on how organizations can improve security and performance with the security solutions built specifically for virtual and hybrid environments. At the end of this webinar, you will learn how to overcome the traditional security solutions in virtual environments, which hinders performance and create bottlenecks. Also, you will get to know how to improve the security performance by 30% with centralized security management. So before we start the presentation, if you have any questions during the webinar, please use the question panel on the right-hand side, and we'll take your questions in the question and answer session. So without any further delay, please welcome our speaker, Landon Fraley, to speak on XenApp and XenDesktop virtualization. Hi, Landon.
Hi, Andrew. Great.
Hey,
thanks for having me on the webinar today. I am excellent. So before we dive into the full presentation, one of the things that I wanted to start out with was kind of a quick poll question for the audience to really kind of get a feel for everybody's familiarity with both VDI, XenDesktop in particular, as well as even potentially XenApp and some of the kind of other Citrix technologies supporting virtual desktops and applications. So we've got the poll out there. Everybody can kind of select one of the options. This will give us an opportunity to kind of understand the content as we move through, really kind of laying the foundation for the broader security focus for the conversation. So we'll just kind of wait a few seconds, let everybody kind of provide their responses, and we'll kind of take it from there. All right, excellent. So I appreciate everybody providing their feedback. And as Manju said, my name is Landon Fraley, and I'm a Principal Sales Engineer in the U.S. Enterprise Organization. And today I wanted to really kind of put the really a foundation for the conversation on security. As some of you may know, for those that do not, Citrix has been a leader in the virtual desktop and application space for a number of years. If you kind of look back to the early founding of the company, it was really talked about as secure access. And in those days, it was really all about one thing, getting to an application, typically hosted in the data center, running on a Windows server, but being able to provide access from any type of endpoint device. And as the industry and the market has evolved, so too has the company, really kind of moving from a secure access messaging into a more specific application delivery messaging. And then in more recent years, that conversation has even changed to include the ideas of virtual desktop infrastructure, hypervisors, virtualization of your app delivery platforms. And more recently, a lot of what we're talking about layers in the increasing complexity of mobile computing and the idea of creating a mobile workspace that ties together all of these concepts. And what we're really moving towards is this idea of a software-defined workplace. So it really kind of shows that Citrix has been a leader for a number of years in this space and has been working to deliver a secure platform for delivering your applications and desktops in one form or another for many years. And as we've evolved through the years, working with our customers to deliver virtual apps and virtual desktops, we've learned a number of things. We've seen a number of things, and it's very clear that end-user computing is becoming increasingly complex, from security risks of laptops in the industry, challenges with mobile devices, smartphones and tablets, and employees wanting to bring in their own devices, the increasing use of telecommuting and being able to work from home, work from a temporary location, and just these innovations have really kind of driven the complexity around end-user computing. It's not as simple as the days of just having that PC on your desk and that's how you got the job done. And this complexity has introduced challenges for both the business and for IT. The business challenges are around newer concepts like BYOD, kind of going back to users wanting to bring their own devices in, this concept of consumerization. The business has to tangle with all of these concepts, all of these ideas. How do they bring it into the organization? How do you handle setting up policies and all of those pieces? So we've obviously addressed or have worked on trying to address those. If we're talking about mobile applications, how do we handle that? How do we handle higher end use cases like designers and engineers? A lot of those pieces are very challenging. And obviously remote and branch office workers. No longer is there one office with all workers in one location. There are remote offices, there are branch offices. How do you get to centralized file shares? How do you get to all the centralized information? So all of these pieces have added to the complexity for the enterprise. And in conjunction with the business side, IT themselves have specific challenges that they're trying to handle and deal with from an end-user computing perspective. The ongoing cycle of dealing with PC refreshes, how do you handle corporate laptops and dealing with offline use cases? How do you deal with imaging and management of the devices? What about contractors and partner access? These have typically been handled in a number of ways, from giving assets to the contractors and partners in order to gain access, setting up specific VPN connections and scenarios. So all of these challenges kind of tie together, creating a situation where you want to move away from the traditional app and desktop management. So VDI is one of the ways to do that. It allows you to move away from this environment of tightly coupling your apps, your devices, and your data. And it forces IT to look at the problem differently, to look at what virtualization can bring to the enterprise and to the organization by separating out these components, the devices, the apps, and the data, and instead focusing on the really critical pieces, the applications and the data, being able to deliver them as a service and provide access to them from anywhere, be it from a corporate asset or from a BYO asset. The solution itself blends together to support these in a common fashion and a common architecture. And this really kind of brings us to, as I mentioned earlier, that evolution that Citrix has been going to as far as creating this mobile workspace concept, because it ties together all of the pieces. from a BYO perspective and having personal apps and personal things on a device, but also providing a secure means to access your corporate desktop, your corporate applications, all of the corporate data you need to get the job done, as well as being able to collaborate with your peers in a fluid and a flexible manner. So this mobile workspace is really the foundation for the solutions that Citrix is delivering, and obviously with a focus on the VDI security and how we can enhance that. The focus is really going to be on XenDesktop specifically. So XenDesktop is Citrix's VDI solution that encompasses application and desktop delivery for all of the use cases that an organization has. It intrinsically has support for BYO initiatives because of the nature of what we're doing with VDI and virtual application delivery, because we're centralizing the data, centralizing the applications and all of those pieces into the data center and providing remote access to them. And the way that we do this, the capability that we have that we talk about is called FlexCast. So FlexCast is all about the options, all about the scenarios. Sometimes users need applications, sometimes users need desktops. And the great thing about XenDesktop is that we can cover off all of these pieces. We can touch on the applications, we can touch on the desktops, and we can deliver them securely from the data center. And the solutions that you're going to hear about from BitDefender work in conjunction with all of these delivery mechanisms, be it some of the physical capabilities, as well as the virtual application delivery from a server in the data center, or a virtual desktop coming from a Windows 7 or a Windows 8 endpoint virtualized in the data center. And again, kind of building on what FlexCast means and what we're talking about with XenDesktop is really the idea of having the most complete solution for desktop virtualization, being able to provide the core VDI capability, but then also being able to build upon our 25 years of delivering applications securely to users in any location, being able to tie together some of these offline use cases for laptops and things like that, and kind of being a leader when it comes to advanced virtualization of GPUs and graphics and support for all of the new devices like Chromebooks and things like that that are coming out. Really kind of gives a breadth to the solution. Pretty much any kind of device that you can find within an enterprise, there's a way for Citrix to provide access into a VDI environment, and that VDI environment has support for some of the most high-end requirements, as well as the most common kind of office productivity solutions that are going to really provide you the greatest ROI and TCO for your solutions. The XenDesktop solution includes a number of capabilities. I'm definitely not going to use this webinar to go through all of them, but at a very high level, we've got management consoles that simplify and focus on the workflows for deploying virtual desktop infrastructure, built-in provisioning capabilities from both an application and a desktop perspective. We have technologies that can automate the process of validating and testing your applications as you look to migrate into VDI environments, support for all of the Microsoft capabilities, be it AppV or System Center, support for a broad range of hypervisors on top, underneath the XenDesktop platform, as well as integration from a remote access perspective with some additional capabilities. With our NetScaler technologies providing access and reporting and visibility into the platform. So a very complete, robust solution is really kind of the outcome of this evolution of Citrix through the years, focusing on customer needs and customer demands as they've grown their comfort with application delivery, desktop delivery, virtualization, and all of these mobile things that are really being driven by the market today. And part of the platform just from a foundational perspective, is our own level of security. So XenDesktop brings to the table a very secure way to provide access to your business critical data and your business critical applications. So some of those challenges that I spoke about earlier as far as contractors, partner access, being able to work from home, dealing with telecommuting, all of these challenges that are there as far as getting into your desktop that may no longer be just sitting on your desk is a core capability and something that we provide through our NetScaler device with ICA proxy into a XenDesktop environment. You'll see some of the smart access control capabilities that we have. This is a fine-grained, granular, policy-based mechanism for controlling what a user can do within a VDI environment based on the type of device they're coming from, whether it's coming from a location that you recognize or not, you know, client certificates, things like that. There's a lot that we have there from just a core security in terms of gaining access to the environment, support for multi-factor authentication, as well as integration with our share file solution for enterprise file sync and share, and the share file solution itself has capabilities for supporting both cloud-based storage as well as on-premise storage, leveraging your existing data repositories. So really just wanted to provide a good foundation for the overall conversation. Really wanted to leave it kind of focused with kind of the security pieces within the virtualized environment. So I want to hand it over to my colleague and friend Sean and let him speak to the specifics of the BitDefender solution and how BitDefender integrates with XenDesktop and can provide some additional levels of security and offload and efficiency.
Thank you, Landon. This is Sean Donaldson with BitDefender, and now that Landon has given us an overview of XenDesktop and many of the advantages of virtualizing desktops, I'm going to get into some of the security questions, especially around performance of endpoint security, that are best avoided when approaching a VDI project. As I go through this, we'll see that endpoint security, of course, specifically anti-malware, it is quite necessary, but it can have a performance impact if not approached appropriately when undertaking a VDI project. So the slide I have up right now is talking about the success metrics, of virtualization. We can see the top ones: improving resource utilization and reduce operational expenses. These are very familiar from when folks first started virtualizing servers. Even more so with servers, it was a very clear consolidation message. When virtualized servers, or the virtualization of servers, first came along, there was a very clear ROI associated with getting more from an existing or from a hardware investment. And that really came down to going from low usage numbers on some servers and high usage numbers on others, and combining those together to be able to essentially run more servers on the same hardware by balancing the usage numbers across a hardware pool. Now with VDI, many of the advantages are outside of cost savings, flexibility, application performance, many of these other things, but really the number of VDI instances that can be run on a given set of hardware is a very important measure. And that is why we see at the top measures or goals, success metrics that are associated with consolidation ratios. Unfortunately, if one tries to use a traditional anti-malware, many of those primary success metrics become very problematic simply because traditional anti-malware is not built to run in a virtualized environment. The reason for this is that when we do a physical to virtual migration, now in the server world, quite often, quite literally, that migration is performed against a physical server, transforming it into a virtualized server. Of course, in the VDI world, it tends to be creating templates and spinning up new desktop instances and building out those templates to suit the needs of an organization. But in general, we can look at it as a P2V migration. Now, what happens with the anti-malware engine is quite often administrators assume that anything that runs within the physical system will be virtualized along with the system itself. It makes sense when we think about things like Microsoft Office and other applications. Unfortunately, with anti-malware, while that might be technically true, and we can have a full anti-malware agent with the scan engine and various data stores running within each VDI instance, that very quickly leads to a tremendous amount of duplication of the footprint, both in memory, impact on storage, impact on network, and all the rest of it. The reason this occurs is because the anti-malware engines, traditional anti-malware engines, are designed to run on hardware islands. So we think about, for instance, our own laptops. They quite often have a full anti-malware client running on them when, for instance, they need to be updated or upgraded, perhaps with the newest definitions, the newest heuristics, upgrading the engine, or doing a full system scan. Since they're designed to run on hardware islands, independent hardware, it's acceptable for them to grab a bunch of resources as is needed. So for instance, the weekly full system scan, essentially the anti-malware fires up and starts scanning the entire computer. In a virtualized environment, if within each and every VDI instance, we have an anti-malware engine that's spinning up and doing that full system scan or accepting an update or an upgrade, what we can have is hundreds of VDI instances on a piece of hardware doing the same thing at the same time, and very quickly the resources of that hardware are saturated. And this is because we're duplicating many of the actions, we're duplicating the footprint across all of these VDI instances. Just looking at the memory footprint, if we consider a typical traditional anti-malware, we'll use, let's say, conservatively 100 megs of RAM. If we have 10 VDI instances, then 10 times 100. If we have 100 VDI instances on a host, 100 times 100. And you can see how very quickly at 100 megs of RAM per system, that ends up chewing up a lot of resources, especially when we look at the typical amount of RAM that is required to run a VDI instance without an anti-malware engine. So that's a significant impact, that's a significant footprint at the enforcement point. Looking at the other side, if you will, of a anti-malware deployment, an endpoint security deployment, we have the management console. In VDI environments, the environment tends to be extremely dynamic. A traditional environment, someone has issued a laptop, that laptop is attached to that person for 3 years, perhaps longer, perhaps shorter, depending on the circumstances. But overall, it's a fairly static environment. In virtualization with VDI, looking at scenarios, for instance, scenarios with task-based workers such as call centers, there can be tens, hundreds, even thousands of VDI instances instantiated every morning, and destroyed every evening at the end of the shift. So that leads to a tremendous amount of turnover. And if the management component of the endpoint security solution is not synchronized with Xen Server or with vCenter, then very quickly that management system will become overwhelmed with entries for VDI instances that don't exist anymore. So these systems, while typically in a traditional way integrated with Active Directory, they also need to integrate with what are now the hubs of information for highly virtualized data centers. So really then, when we look at anti-malware in a virtualized environment, what we need to do is deduplicate that footprint, and we need to centralize it. We do that at something that we call SVA, Security Virtual Appliance. That's a hardened, purpose-built, Linux-based virtual appliance, and it contains a single copy of the anti-malware client. So really, we're leveraging the basic tenets of virtualization. We're centralizing and deduplicating that footprint. So from the perspective of the VDI instances, what we're doing is we're offloading the vast majority of scanning effort to a virtual appliance. And that means a single virtual appliance with a single instance of the anti-malware engine that needs to be maintained, updated, upgraded, and so on. And of course, because the management console is integrated with the virtualization management console, it also knows not to try to scan all VDI instances at the same time, and so on and so forth. Really then, what this becomes is a remote scanning problem. And the question is, how does that virtual appliance gain remote introspection, or the ability to scan VDI instances or virtualized servers remotely? So BitDefender has developed an approach where essentially what we have done is we have pulled all of the anti-malware functionality that makes sense, pulled it out of the VDI instances or the virtualized servers, and it now lives at the security virtual appliance. What we leave behind we call BD tools, BitDefender tools, and that piece is necessary because the virtual appliance needs to have some sort of remote insight. It needs to have a method of introspection and enforcement that it can enforce remotely within the VDI or virtualized server instance. So really, BD tools, it's a communication point. It also has a GUI for the end user, various drivers to facilitate inspection of the file system, and on-demand memory and process scanning, registry scanning in the case of Windows, and so on. Now, this approach, the BitDefender approach, is agnostic of the underlying hypervisor. So there are some approaches out there that require integration with, for instance, a set of APIs within VMware's ESXi. That is a valid approach, and indeed we also integrate with that approach within the same solution. But the BitDefender approach has some significant advantages, including that we control the entire introspection channel, and so that allows us to build in layering of different caches to further boost performance beyond the performance boost associated with centralizing and deduplicating the footprint. What I mean by caching is, of course, if BD Tools has encountered, let's say, a file system object, if it has encountered that before, it will not try to scan it again. It looks at, let's say, a hash of that object, and it knows, I scanned this before, I already have a result. If it hasn't encountered it before, it will take that hash and send a query to the virtual appliance and ask, have you scanned this before? In virtualized environments, especially VDI environments, the environments tend to be quite homogeneous. most of the VDI instances are spun up from a very small set of templates. And so they tend to be very, very similar. And so there's a very good chance that the virtual appliance has already encountered that file before. And indeed, to give the virtual appliance a head start, we pre-populate it with a whole bunch of information about various Windows and Linux versions, so that when it first encounters standard files, let's say standard Windows system files, it doesn't need to scan them. Now, in the case of, let's say, user data, where it encounters a file that it has not seen before, it's not the case that BDTools transfers that entire file to the virtual appliance for scanning. The way anti-malware works, even with a full agent living within an endpoint, it looks at the file header so that it can, the first few chunks of the file, so that it can understand what type of file it is. And with that information, it then starts requesting a few blocks here, a few blocks there, until it basically can figure out if that file is malicious or if it's benign. So really, even if it's a multi-gig file, it's grabbing a few blocks here, a few blocks there, based on the information. And that's an iterative process until it determines if that file is malicious, suspicious, or otherwise. So in all of that, there's, of course, another opportunity to do block level caching. So we have multiple layers of caching that really improve performance above and beyond simply centralizing and deduplicating the anti-malware footprint, which is, of course, very important from a performance perspective. So comparing these approaches, the traditional offloading approach, which is facilitated by hypervisor APIs in ESXi, versus a BitDefender approach, we see quite a few differences. So when it comes to how the centralization and deduplication is performed, traditionally it's through hypervisor APIs. On the other hand, BitDefender controls the entire introspection channel. So it's BitDefender technology end to end. It's not a mix of technologies. Hypervisor requirements, of course, being an API within ESXi, the traditional approach is limited to ESXi and ESXi only. BitDefender is agnostic of the underlying hypervisor, so whether it's Xen, Hyper-V, KVM, ESXi, any mix of different hypervisor technologies, essentially it doesn't matter to us what the virtualization technology is. As far as the footprint within the VDI or server instances, in the case of the hypervisor APIs, it doesn't provide a GUI, it doesn't provide memory and process scanning, and so a slimmed down version of BDTools is still required. However, the file system driver piece is embedded in a different tool set that belongs to VMware. Now, that always needs to be there. There needs to be a communication point. There needs to be, if one wishes to do file system inspection, a file system driver. So while there is a phrase agentless that is used to describe this approach, it's a great marketing phrase, but the reality is there always has to be a footprint within the VDI instance or virtualized server. In the case of the BitDefender approach, there's, of course, just one piece, which is BDTools, and it has all the tools that are necessary, including the file system driver, GUI, and so on. When it comes to flexibility around that security virtual appliance, with the traditional approach, it's tied to an API within the hypervisor, and so you can have one virtual appliance on each host, and the endpoints, the protected VDI instances on that host, they cannot fail over to an SVA, a virtual appliance, on another host, because this API is not built to bridge between hosts. With BitDefender, of course, we're not tied to the underlying hypervisor, so endpoints will happily fail over to a virtual appliance running on another host. And indeed, when we sit down and architect the ideal solution, it may well be that from a performance perspective, we don't need a virtual appliance on each and every host. Operating systems, the traditional hypervisor API, it supports only Windows, and again, only on ESXi. With BD tools, we support both Windows and Linux running on any hypervisor, so there's a lot of flexibility there. What's interesting about this flexibility is the impact when we consider public cloud. The largest public cloud provider out there by quite a margin is Amazon's AWS, Amazon Web Services, EC2. It happens to run on a modified version of Xen. Obviously, if we tried to run this solution in Amazon and we required hypervisor APIs, Amazon probably wouldn't want to help us with that. But because we're independent of the underlying hypervisor, we actually have a version of this solution that's available from AWS Marketplace. So tons of flexibility. Up to this point, I've focused on securing VDI instances, virtualized servers, because of course that's the topic today, but we don't focus solely on that. We recognize that there's a time and a place for point solutions. However, having a collection of point solutions is not ideal for most organizations. I call it the yet another console syndrome, where every time something new pops up in the environment, an organization is forced to go out and grab yet another console. Instead, we've taken a different approach. We have something called Gravity Zone. Gravity Zone is our endpoint security management console. It itself is a virtual appliance. That virtual appliance can be cloned as many times as is needed to satisfy the requirements of a particular deployment. Now, each clone of that virtual appliance can play a different role in that Gravity Zone deployment. Some may play the role of data store, running an open source database called MongoDB, which is embedded within Gravity Zone. So we don't need an external SQL database. Being a virtual appliance, of course, it's Linux-based, so we don't need Windows systems to install the management console on. By playing these different roles, including load balancer, web application for the management application, communication servers, the Gravity Zone as a single deployment, really it behaves like a private cloud. And it can expand, it can contract, it's elastic, simply by adding more virtual appliances or removing virtual appliances. If a new data center is set up or perhaps acquired via a corporate acquisition, it's as simple as spinning up Gravity Zone virtual appliances and having that same single Gravity Zone deployment flow onto those new virtual appliances in the new data center. So it can be distributed in a significant number of different ways. And again, it's really an elastic private cloud more so than it's a dedicated management console. Of course, it integrates with Xen Server. It integrates with vCenter. It also provides via different modules. And again, this is because Gravity Zone is so scalable. We can put as many modules as we wish. It can also protect standard endpoints. As Landon touched on, people are accessing VDI instances from laptops, from desktops, and from mobile clients. And so we can also protect those. This is on top of course, virtualized endpoints. And also quite recently, we added Exchange. So with Gravity Zone, because it scales so well, we're just going to keep adding modules to Gravity. So to conclude this portion, VDI is enabling change, work from anywhere. This is what end users demand, and indeed it's good for organizations to improve productivity and really give people the ability to do things when they need to, from wherever they need to, and how they want to. And in that, flexibility is key. Instant on, scale, centralizing data is quite valuable from a security and corporate data protection standpoint. But the security tool needs to be flexible. The security tool needs to be architected to have minimal impact on the performance characteristics. To again go back to those success metrics of virtualization, if the performance of the endpoint security is such that it completely skews those success metrics, the ROI of a VDI project will very quickly get skewed. And unfortunately, admins will either have to buy more hardware or scale down the number of virtualized desktops that they plan to put on the hardware that they have procured. That's not ideal. So security needs to be flexible, and it needs to be flexible both from an enforcement and a management standpoint. Finally, security needs to be baked in. When we look at these deployments, when we look at these technologies, it's really about providing services to end users. When building a service, if we try to bolt on security toward the end of the project, that will lead to problems. If there's, let's say, a corporate standard traditional anti-malware, even if it's BitDefender's traditional anti-malware, that will put that VDI project in jeopardy. And that's something that you want to avoid before you go into production. So bake in a virtualization-centric anti-malware solution as you're building up that VDI deployment. Now, most often, this is where I end this presentation. But before we go to Q&A, I will very quickly cover a technology that we recently announced. This is a technology that is coming out of our research and development groups. Up to now, what I've discussed when it comes to securing endpoints is really a re-architecture of anti-malware. So what we're doing with anti-malware and what we've done on traditional endpoints is at first anti-malware ran as an application in user mode, but as attacks became more sophisticated, those attacks started operating in kernel mode, in ring 0 within operating systems, and so that's where anti-malware went. Today, anti-malware inspection, even if we're talking about the re-architected version of anti-malware inspection for virtualized environments, that piece that runs within each VM, the file system driver and other pieces to facilitate memory scanning and so on, they still run at kernel mode. Although the inspection may be facilitated by hypervisor APIs, that's just building a communication channel between the virtual appliance and the protected virtualized instance. It doesn't change where that inspection takes place. It still takes place at kernel mode, the same place where the attacks are occurring within a VM. So if we consider a rootkit, rootkits quite often are leveraging the same kernel functionality, the same operating system kernel functionality as the security tools that are attempting to detect them. So that creates a standoff. And we also have another problem, which is, by definition, those security tools are not isolated from the system that they are protecting. They run within the system that they are protecting. That gives the advantage of tremendous context. For instance, a network IDS or IPS device is isolated from the endpoints that it hopes to protect, but it has very limited context. It doesn't have rich context to be able to apply security within. However, running within the endpoint, anti-malware is susceptible to compromise if that endpoint itself is compromised. What we've done at BitDefender is we looked at what we could do given virtualization, where instead of the supervisor running as part of the operating system, communicating directly with the underlying hardware, we have an abstraction layer, which is the hypervisor. So anything that runs within kernel mode that's, for instance, trying to manipulate memory, write or read memory, goes through the hypervisor. Ultimately, the hypervisor is what is communicating with hardware directly. And so what we did is, based on the OpenZen hypervisor, our research teams extended some APIs and they created a set of introspection APIs, which, by the way, are open source. Those APIs allow us to look at raw memory from the viewpoint of the hypervisor. So if kernel mode is ring 0, and if that's where, for instance, rootkits and other sophisticated malware are operating, this inspection technology operates at ring -1. It is below. It has full context of what is occurring within kernel and user mode of each virtualized instance, but it is isolated from those instances. So, for instance, if a malware or an attack comes in, attempts to manipulate memory, and what I mean by that is things like buffer overflow, code injection into processes, heap spray, some of these broad techniques that have been used for many, many years to attack systems, we can look for attempts to undertake these, and the malware cannot hide. It cannot manipulate what the security tool sees, because the security tool is running its inspection at the hypervisor level. So it cannot hide, and indeed, long before malware is pushed down onto a system, we can see someone attempting to exploit a vulnerability remotely, because most often that involves manipulating memory in a way to produce unexpected results. We will see that from the hypervisor level via hypervisor-based memory introspection. Further, if an organization wishes to, they can inject cleanup tools on the fly into running virtualized instances. These cleanup tools, they're not installed. It does not require a restart of the system. They simply are injected into a running VM, clean up that VM, and then they're removed as though they were not ever there. Now, overall, the focus of this technology is on memory, and all attacks, really, they begin at memory, within memory, I should say. And so that's where we're focusing. This isn't a replacement for anti-malware. It's a complementary technology. And indeed, this technology can be used to protect the anti-malware drivers that are running within a system, because we still want those anti-malware drivers to do things like file system inspection, because this technology is focused on memory. So this is a very new technology. We'll continue to develop this and productize it through the year. At this point, I will hand it back over for Q&A.
Hey, thank you, Sean, and thank you, Landon. And there were some technical problems hearing our times during the session, and to all the attendees, we see what best we can do while sharing the recording of it. So with that said, we'll move to question and answer sessions. We have a few questions from few attendees who could hear you properly. The first question is, what are the most common mistakes you see in organizations when while implementing the VDI?
So before Landon answers, I could definitely say that trying to consider using traditional anti-malware, or let's say the same old anti-malware as used on physical end-user systems when going to VDI, that will definitely lead to problems. But that's a very security-centric view. There may be other pitfalls that Landon knows of.
Sure. So, I mean, more generally, and it's honestly in the same lines as what Sean just answered as far as the security perspective. It's understanding your use cases and really looking at the impact of pulling all of these desktops into the data center and doing VDI with them. So with things like storage, things like what are we doing with profiles, the best practices in those areas. And Citrix has a lot of white papers and documentation, blueprints, design guides, things like that, that are available if you go to our blog site that discuss this. But basically, understanding that impact to your back-end infrastructure as you pull all of these resources in, much in the same way that using your traditional antivirus and anti-malware technologies in a VDI environment puts an undue burden on the back-end systems because you've got a lot of duplication of efforts. The same type of things happen, or similar types of problems with I/O from a storage perspective. You now have a lot of little desktop VMs doing a lot of similar things, but they're having to be serialized and pipelined by your storage infrastructure and everything. So understanding those problems and leveraging some of the capabilities in our provisioning technologies can really help with that. And again, kind of looking at those white papers that we have on our blog site from our Citrix consulting group is going to probably be my best recommendation.
Great. Thanks, London. So the next question is, probably Sean can take this. Question is, what sort of performance improvements should an organization see when using a virtualization-specific security solutions compared to traditional offerings?
So, and I switched off my headset. I hope this is better for everyone. But obviously, performance results will vary. But internally at BitDefender, we used a security standard testing tool called Login VSI. And of course, we've compared against our own traditional solution versus the virtualization specific solution. And we've compared against other folks out there just to understand where we are. A thumb in the wind is one can expect about a 20 to 30% improvement in performance. And that may sound like a significant piece, but especially if we look at VDI specifically, if we think about the resources that we assign to each instance in a VDI scenario, and then we consider that a typical full anti-malware client will easily take 100 megs of RAM, plus a certain hit on CPU, plus IOPS hit. It becomes somewhat intuitive to see, hey, if we centralize all of that in a virtual appliance and leave behind something like BD Tools that has all of a 10 or 12 megabyte footprint in RAM, we're going to be able to get back a whole bunch of resources. So just a thumb in the wind benchmark, expect 20 to 30%.
Okay, great. The next question is, does VDI can be implemented in CAD like AutoCAD?
Yeah, so I can take that one. I believe I may have answered it in the actual question for anybody that's kind of skimming through, but we actually have a very strong partnership with Autodesk, Citrix that is, and AutoCAD as a solution is supported from both a kind of XenApp server-based delivery mechanism as well as XenDesktop VDI-based delivery, and we've got a number of technologies in the advanced kind of GPU virtualization, as well as some of our advanced codecs to support those designers and engineers that are using tools like AutoCAD or Revit or some of those other technologies that are in that higher end.
Great. So the next question is about the antivirus. Probably Sean can take this. Question is, I'm running XenApp 6.5 virtualization. Can I still use and benefit from moving my antivirus to the hypervisor?
So yes, certainly, and we have worked with quite a few organizations using XenApp. So I think the quick answer on that is yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. So next question is, have you done any type of or any time of performance testing comparing this approach to traditional antivirus solutions?
Yes, we have. Again, using login VSI. I don't know the URL off the top of my head, but we have published a white paper. We in fact just finished up another round of testing with login VSI. For those who may not be familiar, login VSI, essentially what it does is it goes in, there's some complicated math and statistics under the hood, but what it does is exercise certain pieces to mimic end user activity, and from that we can take different measurements. For instance, how many VDI instances can run on a given piece of hardware. We, of course, have done very well, and we use that as a tool as we develop and as we continue to improve performance to understand how we're doing, essentially. And anyway, for more details, definitely check out the Login VSI white paper that we have published on our site.
Great. So the next question is, does BitDefender have any other solutions, or is it only antivirus malware?
So BitDefender, over the years, we've been around since 2001. We do have quite a few different solutions. Historically, BitDefender concentrated publicly on consumer and small and home office solutions. Enterprise-centric solutions we would take out through an OEM channel. About 5 years ago, given some of the research around virtualization-centric security that was coming out of our labs, as well as the architecture of Gravity Zone, we decided that that technology was something that we could grow the company on the enterprise side by bringing to market as BitDefender rather than strictly through an OEM channel. So we do have quite a few different things. I think I mentioned we've recently added to Gravity Zone security for Exchange, so anti-malware and anti-spam on the SMTP stream. We do also have a lot of other point products covering things like SharePoint and so on that we will perhaps over time bring into Gravity Zone. Obviously, Gravity Zone can scale, but from a product to roadmap, we need to balance that against things like the hypervisor memory introspection, which is, I wouldn't call it anti-malware, it's a very new way of protecting virtualized instances by taking advantage of the architecture of virtualization. So we do have quite a spread. We also have quite a bit in research, but really what we've seen in the market today, the biggest struggle that enterprises are having is around anti-malware and the performance impact in virtualized environments. So that's what we tend to concentrate on at trade shows, on webinars, etc.
Great, thanks, Sean. So we have one more question here. BitDefender gives solutions for external endpoints like laptops on BYOD, and how can we manage them?
So absolutely, external endpoints are, well, the idea of a perimeter has quickly faded over the years, hasn't it? So there are several ways to address that. It really depends on your environment. Because Gravity Zone can be distributed, you can, for instance, have a couple of Gravity Zone virtual appliances in the DMZ that you make available externally, but the data, let's say the heart of Gravity Zone, is buried behind multiple layers deep in your infrastructure. Another way to address that, and we found some highly distributed customers are interested in the version that we host ourselves. In fact, it's hosted on Amazon, or a version of Gravity Zone that is hosted by a partner. So certainly addressing external endpoints, the short answer is yes, it can be done, but figuring out the best way to do it really comes down to having a conversation with each organization and figuring out which method best suits them.
Great, thanks, Sean. So I think we have only one last question. So the question is there any integration with NetScaler for remote work users?
So if that's a question for me at BitDefender, the short answer is no. Really, we integrate with Xen Server, and quite frankly, I don't know. From a technical perspective, I'm not deep enough on the NetScaler side to understand if there would be an advantage to integrating there.
Sean, I don't know if it's necessarily any value, so to speak, to directly integrate with NetScaler, but I would say that from an overall perspective, the NetScaler integrates with the XenDesktop solution, and so that means that your remote users coming in through NetScaler into this environment are going to work when BitDefender is protecting the XenDesktop piece on the back end. So nothing directly within NetScaler, just because it's providing policy and control and kind of the capabilities built into kind of the overall XenDesktop Citrix solution. And a lot of the benefits that you've been kind of talking about from a security perspective have been on the endpoint that the user is connecting to, be it a virtual desktop, be it a XenApp server that has the same type of offload capabilities baked into it. So it's more of a benefit by extension.
Great.
Okay, thanks for fleshing that out.
Great, thank you so much, Landon and Sean. I think we don't have any more questions. We are winding up the question and answer session. So with that said, we knew there were some technical problems hearing Sean during his session. So we will try to see what best we can do on that before we share the recording with all the attendees. So before we wind up for the day, I want to take a moment to thank our speakers, Sean and Landon, and his team from BitDefender for making this wonderful presentation and sharing the knowledge with us. And last but not the least,
Thank you very much.
all for attending today's webinar in the Citrix Study Technical Webinar Series. And this concludes our broadcast. Thank you.